Commission meeting of May 17th, 2023. I call the meeting to order at 7 p.m. For those joining us in person, please note that due to our hybrid environment, audio and video presentations can no longer be shared from the lectern. Requests to show an audio or video presentation during the meeting should be directed to epc@mountainview.gov by 4:30 p.m. on the meeting date. Additionally, due to our hybrid environment, we will no longer have speakers line up to speak on an item. Anyone wishing to address the EPC in person must complete a yellow speaker card. Please indicate the name you would like to be called by when it is your turn to speak and the item number on which you wish to speak. Please complete one yellow speaker card for each item on which you wish to speak and turn them into the EPC clerk as soon as possible, but no later than the call for public comment on the item you were speaking on. Instructions for addressing the commission virtually may be found on the posted agenda. Now, I will ask the EPC clerk to take roll call.
Commissioner Clark?
Here.
Commissioner Preston?
Here.
Commissioner Gutierrez?
Present.
Here. Commissioner Nunes?
Here.
Vice Chair Dempsey?
Here.
Chair In.
Here. Roll call is finished. So there are no minutes to approve, so we will move on to oral communications from the public. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons wishing to address the EPC on any matter not on the agenda. Speakers are allowed to speak on any topic for up to 3 minutes during this section. State law prohibits the commission from acting on non-agenda items. If anyone in attendance would like to provide comments on non-agenda items, please fill out the yellow card and provide it to the EPC clerk. If anyone on Zoom would like to provide comment on non-agenda items, please click the raise hand button in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Phone users can mute and unmute themselves with *6.
There's no speaker in the room or on Zoom.
Thank you. All right, then we'll just proceed to 5, new business. 5.1, retreat and development review process overview. We'll first have staff presentations, then public comment. At the closure of public comment, the commission will then discuss the item, including any questions. And for the staff presentation, we have Krishna Pellinar, Acting Senior Planner, Lindsay Hagan, Assistant Community Development Director, John Schwartz, CEQA Consultant with JHS Consulting, Eric Anderson, Advanced Planning Manager, and Arti Shrivastava, Assistant City Manager, Community Development Director.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Krisha Panoyar, Acting Senior Planner, and we're here to give a brief overview on the development review process, matrix study improvements, and CEQA review. So cities have development review authority to protect the public health, safety, convenience, and welfare of its residents. This allows land use and zoning regulations, such as implementation of general plans, zoning ordinance, and precise plans. The general plan is a comprehensive visioning document that guides future growth. The zoning ordinance dictates permitted land uses and development regulations. The general plan has identified 5 change areas to become precise plans to allow for additional growth and planned public improvements. These precise plans allow for more specific zoning standards and address more local conditions. Currently, we have 25 precise plans, but some recently adopted precise plans include the East Wisman, North Bay Shore, El Camino Real, and San Antonio precise plans. State legislation also impacts the development review process. The Permit Streamlining Act, for example, sets time limits and procedures for review of development projects. Other state laws have superseded cities' regulations and have impacted cities' development review process in some shape or form. Some of these are listed here. To understand development review, it's important to keep in mind the different land use decisions which impact how a decision is made and the amount of discretion that can go behind decision-making. 3 categories include the following. Ministerial decisions are those made with no discretion. A project either conforms to the requirements or does not. If a project conforms to all requirements, it cannot be denied. Examples include building permits, change in use permits, ADUs, and SB 35 affordable housing projects. Quasi-judicial decisions include some level of discretion. This requires certain findings to support city code requirements and policies. Projects that fall under quasi-judicial discretionary decisions include most development projects, such as new developments, conditional use permits, variances, and heritage tree removals. Legislative decisions do not fall under the constraints of existing regulations, as the decisions modify or create new policies or laws. These include general plan, zoning, or precise plan amendments such as gatekeeper projects. However, please note, some legislative decisions may be superseded by state requirements and limits flexibility on these types of decisions. For example, the state RENA requirements required rezones as part of the housing element previously presented at EPC. Other nuanced examples to keep in mind that EPC may encounter may require both quasi-judicial decisions and legislative decisions, such as the 555 Middlefield residential project. This includes a quasi-judicial decision be made for the project itself and a legislative decision for the rezoning. During this presentation, we'll cover the 3 main steps for the development review process. This includes optional review for pre-entitlements, planning review, and post-entitlements. Pre-entitlements occurs before a formal application submittal. There are a few types of pre-entitlement reviews. The first one is the informal review. The informal review allows the developer to submit an application and conceptual materials of their proposed design. The application materials are reviewed by all departments and comments are provided to highlight high-level issues associated with their proposed development. This process is intended for the applicant to make modifications to better address the city's adopted design objectives or city requirements. The informal review do not require a fee and helps developers make a decision on whether or not to move forward with the project. SB 330 preliminary applications allow developers to submit materials consistent with state law. Once a completed preliminary application is submitted, this allows applicants to vest the local planning and zoning rules in place at the time of application submittal. SB 35 is a streamlined ministerial approval process for affordable housing projects. The preliminary application for SB 35 projects is intended to allow for tribal consultation to occur. And lastly, the gatekeeper process applies to projects seeking a general plan and zoning amendment. This process requires interested developers to go through a city council authorization hearing. At this hearing, city council determines on whether a zoning or general plan amendment should move forward with a formal application submittal. So the project review begins once a formal application and associated materials are submitted to planning staff. During this initial project review, environmental assessment begins. Once an application is submitted, the application is reviewed by planning staff and other departments. If the application is missing key application materials as listed in the formal application checklist, the project is deemed incomplete. The planner then compiles comments and missing items from all departments and sends to the developer. This must all occur within 30 days from application submittal due to Permit Streamlining Act requirements. The developer then makes revisions to their projects and resubmits the revised plans and missing items for project review. This process continues until an application is deemed complete and a decision is made on the project. In addition to the departmental review, community meetings are typically scheduled, especially for new construction projects. These meetings allow members to provide input on the project design and overall project. Meetings include neighborhood meetings and DRC meetings. Larger, more complex projects may require additional EPC and city council study sessions. The neighborhood meeting is a developer-held meeting intended to get feedback from the neighborhood regarding their project. Developers will send notices to neighbors within 750 feet of the property as well as neighborhood associations. The Development Review Committee is an advisory body that is chaired by the Deputy Zoning Administrator and includes 2 consulting architects. This is intended to provide feedback on site design and architecture to meet city's design guidelines and improve neighborhood compatibility. Projects seeking key input on deviations or legislative changes may involve Environmental Planning Commission and City Council study sessions to get direction from decision-making bodies during the project review process. Once developers receive feedback, these comments are incorporated to the project design. So along with meetings for community input and project review, technical studies such as environmental review, utility impact studies, multimodal transportation analysis is worked on throughout the project timeframe. Details on environmental assessments as per California Environmental Quality Act will be discussed following the presentation. So there are a few key components to look at during the planning review, and these are listed here. There's completeness. Are all necessary documents submitted? This is important as permit streamlining Act sets timeframes for planning permit review. Once a project is deemed complete, a decision must be made within a certain timeframe. Codes and regulations. Does the project comply with the general plan, zoning ordinance, precise plan, and other city adopted guidelines? Context. How does the project relate to the adjacent property? Are there heritage trees worth preserving? How does circulation throughout the site work? And are there impacts to existing pedestrian vehicular network? Community input. What feedback did the project receive from neighborhood groups, members of the public, and other public bodies? Nexus and proportionality. Are the project specific requirements proportional to the project's impacts on the community? And departmental review. So staff from building, public works, housing, forestry, and fire will also review the project and consider these key items listed here. So once a project is deemed complete, a decision on the project can be made. It's important to note that not all projects require public hearings and can be reviewed at staff level. However, for projects that do require a public hearing, it will require additional noticing. So mailers will be sent to property owners located 750 feet of the project site. A notice will be posted in the newspaper of the public hearing. On-site project signs will be installed. Emails will be sent to community and stakeholder groups. And for larger projects, additional information is available through specific project web pages on the city's website. So project approvals may vary and can be approved at zoning administrator level, or they may require city council approval. EPC typically reviews development projects that request general plan or zoning amendments, or development projects requesting bonus FAR. After planning approvals, applicants will submit for post-entitlement permits, such as building permits and excavation permits. During this stage, applicants will work with staff to ensure the planning conditions of approval are fulfilled, legal agreements are finalized, and impact fees are paid. Once the building permit is issued, construction may begin. Entitlements are not vested until construction begins. So if a project does not begin construction within 2 years, their entitlements expire unless they apply for a permit extension. During construction, periodic inspections from the building division, fire division, and public works department will occur to ensure construction-related materials are implemented. Planning will also conduct inspections to ensure color and material match the entitled sets. Following construction, the project may have requirements that must be followed after the project is built as part of ongoing operations. An example is transportation demand management, monitoring, and reporting. So overall, the development review process is complex and includes multiple steps. There are different priorities that must be balanced for a project that supports the city's goals and policies. However, there's more room to improve the development review process. And so I'll turn it over to Assistant Community Development Director Hagan to discuss how the city's improving this process.
Thank you, Ms. Pennelar. So I think as we can all recognize, the development review process is really an important process to implementing the city's vision of having a diverse community and an inclusive and vibrant community. And over the years, some of the laws which Krisha mentioned, state laws and new federal laws have really complicated the process and has made the development review process more complex. Additionally, new local and regional regulations have complicated, processes. And in general, there's just a stronger interest in increasing expectation from the community in development. And so really with all of these factors coming into play, the city in 2020 hired Matrix Consulting Group to really assess our development review process and look at our permitting processes. And this really means planning permits, building permits, really all permits related to development. And this was an assessment of every single department in the city that relates to development. And so roughly a little over a year, Matrix spent assessing our process. They conducted online surveys with recent applicants. They interviewed city staff, council members. They had focus groups, one-on-one meetings with developers. They evaluated and looked at all of our documentation, all of our procedures, processes. They also looked at our technology and our staffing. And so with that, their first step was identifying some of some of the findings they made with our existing processes. So focusing kind of on what some of their initial findings were in that study. Some of the strengths that they identified of our current process is that city staff does provide detailed comment letters and detailed staff reports. Some folks mentioned some of our online services. The most popular one mentioned was the building inspections and how people can schedule that online, and that's beneficial. Also that for planning and building permits that they are reviewed concurrently across city departments. Not all cities do that, so that was something they highlighted as a strength of ours. And that we're using contract staff appropriately. We're using them for peak workloads or for specialty kind of niche skill sets. And then also that we transitioned to paperless and virtual appointments very quickly during COVID. So some of the common themes that came out of their assessment and communication with various parties on desired improvements really focus around having more enhanced online services related to permitting or more information in general online that's easier to find and easier to understand. There's an overall dissatisfaction with our permitting timelines, and also that while we might have a concurrent review, that we got feedback around having poor coordination. And I think really what was meant behind that is more some of our comments are not consistent or they're conflicting, so it's not providing clarity or clear direction to the applicant. And so as a result, that's reflecting poorly in customer service or maybe not being solution oriented. So you can move on to the next slide, thank you. So out of their assessment, they had 53 recommendations that they focused on. And those recommendations really fall into 3 categories. The first being about process improvements, so ways to improve coordination, provide clearer information, and reduce our timelines. The second category about technology enhancements, adding new technologies that improve process and support online permitting. A big piece of feedback we heard through this process was about transparency, being able to understand where your permit is in the process, who you can contact, who's reviewing your permit, and things like that, as well as having the ability to, for the city to produce data that supports or outlines our performance as city staff on permitting in our process, as well as a desire for an improved city website. And the third category is really about people and service levels. So really about filling staff vacancies and looking at staff training and customer service training in particular. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into what we've done in relation to those 3 categories, what we've done to date in terms of implementing some of these recommendations. So focusing on process improvements first. There's really 3 key teams that I want to talk about. The first is the innovation team. So this is a team that is made up of key managers and department heads in community development and public works, which are 2 main departments working on development permits. And really the focus of this team, I would say, is 2-part. One is to provide a venue in which issues that can't be resolved at the project manager level can be elevated and addressed in a very efficient and effective manner with department heads and other key managers in the same room. And so having this dedicated meeting that we have once a month allows us to have this venue to get this direction and be more efficient and effective in getting solutions and moving forward on projects. It also, by its very nature, creates an environment where it empowers managers to be able to take the direction they received and move forward in implementing things. So I think indirectly or directly, you're sort of helping develop that skill set of being able to lead more effectively at the management level instead of going to the department heads all the time. So I think that's really been a great improvement that we've made in terms of having that meeting in that venue. The second group or team is the permit navigation team. So I lead this team. This team is made up of 1 representative from planning, building, and public works. And really those 3 groups are key in most of our development permits. And this group allows us to be a little bit more nimble in trying to address permit issues, primarily during the building permit phase. So it allows us to kind of coordinate quickly, figure out sort of who's taking the lead on resolving certain issues on a permit, and allow us to kind of move effectively and efficiently through a process to get a permit unstuck, I'll say. And then the third group is the Project Coordinating Committee, or PCC. So this is a group that's actually been around for 2 decades. It's part of our, it's led by the planning team. And it's an avenue in which we distribute and review planning permits across all the city departments. So it's made up of roughly 80 to 100 people at any given time within the city. And it's all parties or all people that are involved in reviewing planning permits. And so this group meets once a week to go over permits that are actively in the review process. So as Ms. Pennelar mentioned, that 30-day window that we have to review a project application, it's really what during that window this meeting would be taking place. And every department has 2 weeks to review materials and either identify inconsistencies, corrections, missing information, and then provide their comments to the project planner, who then collates everything and passes it on to the applicant. So as part of this PCC process, if you don't mind going to the next slide, we actually track how many, or the on-time response rate for the different parties involved. So on the left here of this table, you'll see all the different groups that are involved in the review of planning permits. And so this would be on time within that 2-week time frame. So they have to provide the comments within those 2 weeks, and then they're considered on time. In the last half of 2021, I should back up a little, sorry. During COVID, we disengaged this group. So we were not using the PCC platform. And so the first column here, July to December 2021, reflects that what happened there, which is that we had a very poor success rate of being on time at 57%. When we re-engaged the PCC process through a different platform, now using a virtual platform, and we re-engaged throughout the calendar year for 2022, you can see we've dramatically increased our success rate of being on time. And really what's important here is providing comments on time gives the planner time to then go through the comments, make sure everything's coordinated, consistent, and that we're not giving conflicting information to the applicant. Ultimately, that's our goal, is to provide clear and direct communication to the applicant. So moving on, looking at the technology improvements, some of you may have heard that we've launched our online permitting system for building permits. We launched that last month. It's called ePermits MB. And so we started with building permits, since that is the highest volume that we have. So we started there first. And so far in the first 30 days, we've gotten a lot of positive feedback about how much easier it is to submit all of your materials, track them, see who's commenting on stuff when they're done with their review. So a lot of positive feedback so far about it. We actually just kicked off developing the planning and public works modules to the system. So ultimately the goal is to have all permits funnel through this one program. That way it's easy for people, they just learn it once and then they stick with it the whole time. And so we hope to have that release either late this year or early next year. So we'll add those modules on. The other technology update, if anyone happens to have gone to mountainview.gov today, you'll notice that it's a brand new website launched today. So it represents our new brand, our new color scheme. It's much more modern, easier to navigate. I think all around much better site. An exciting piece of that is that we're actually developing specific development permit related pages, which we're developing right now. And we will be adding to the website this summer. And so these pages are really trying to reframe how we share information and provide information about the permit process to any interested party. So for example, if someone's interested in installing a jacuzzi in their backyard, they can get their information on one page with all the key information they need about permit fees, costs, process, information that they need to submit. So really it's trying to make more of a one-stop shop for various types of projects and present the information in a very clear and consistent way. So we're pretty excited about that. And then last but not least, the last category about people and service levels. I think an important thing to update is just about our staffing vacancies, because that ultimately impacts our ability to provide service. So these numbers up here represent the building, planning, and public works land development groups. These are the main groups that make up and are part of the development review process. In general, planning has had a pretty significant vacancy rate for the last year or so. And I am proud to say now that we did onboard 4 new planners in the last 30 days. So they're new to our team, but we're very excited to have them. And I think it's made a huge dent in the staff vacancies. And with that, I think I will pass it on to John.
It's all right, I'll move over here just to mix it up. Evening, Madam Chair, members of the commission. Again, I'm John Schwartz. I'm an environmental consultant to the city, and my role is to assist the planning department and the staff managing, overseeing, and vetting the environmental review for various development projects. So I've been before you many times over the years, and thanks for having me here today. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about reviewing some of the basics of CEQA and the different levels of review, just as a refresher. I know many of you have been at this for some time and are familiar with all these documents, but we figured we'd review some of that information and talk about some issues and nuances and kind of consideration things that come up a lot. So CEQA, again, is California Environmental Quality Act. It's a state law that basically requires agencies like the city to disclose and evaluate the environmental impacts of development projects and activities before they go forward with them. So the main basic overarching purposes of CEQA are to disclose impacts, provide information to decision makers like yourselves and the general public, and really kind of daylight and disclose the decision-making process and encourage participation. So other purposes identified in the law are to avoid impacts if possible, and also to consider alternative designs, especially in an EIR process, which I'll talk about in just a minute. CEQA, from a mindset perspective, is procedural, right? It's not a permit that gets issued. It's not a decision. It's a process we have to go through, an analysis. And so it applies to discretionary projects where the city is making a judgment call about something. It doesn't apply to ministerial projects, as was touched on earlier, some of the various ministerial things the city does on a regular basis. CEQA doesn't typically apply to those. Go ahead, one more. I won't spend any time on this slide. This is just a smattering of the range of environmental topic areas and issues you see in the environmental documents that come before you. And these are all cataloged in the guidelines with questions and answers we need to provide to address them. This slide's a little dense, but I just want to touch on the 3 main levels of environmental review under CEQA. It's kind of 3 process document tracks. One is an exemption. The state legislature has carved out statutory exemptions. This is the quickest and simplest thing, where basically we say CEQA is not required. We fill out a form, it gets posted to the county and the state, and we're done. Examples of statutory exemptions, the one that always sticks out to me, it's been in the guidelines for years, is hosting the Olympics and preparing for the Olympics. You don't have to do CEQA review for stuff like that. And there's a whole host of them now, and more have been added over the years. But categorical exemptions are categories of projects that typically don't have significant environmental impacts. You're never out of the woods, though, because if you have a unique circumstance or a special problem with that project that's going to result in impacts, you may not be able to do an exemption. But typically, things like maintenance and repair, minor alteration of facilities, utility replacements, if you tore down a small office building and built a new one in the same place, same capacity, that kind of stuff usually qualifies for an exemption. Initial study negative declaration, or mitigated negative declaration many times, is the middle tier process and document. It's a checklist of all those issue areas I touched on, and we go through that to determine whether the project is going to result in any significant impacts. If they can be mitigated and reduced, then we can proceed with the negative declaration, and the process is shorter. If we cannot, and we have impacts that are significant that we cannot avoid or reduce, we get kicked into the full environmental impact report, which is the most robust process and document and analysis. So as you know, it's got additional steps in it for public involvement. It also has some additional sections in the document that are required, like a summary and a discussion of alternatives. I won't spend much time on this either. This is a very simple steps for the initial study process. There's probably several steps in each of these boxes, but just for illustration, we typically start, once we have a project and an application filed, we start with various technical studies. Depending on the site and the project, we might do biological analyses, traffic and VMT, air quality, noise, hazardous materials, whatever the case might be. Then we put together administrative versions of the initial study. We hash those out as a group, revise it, churn it, and then we get it ready for the public review. That document gets published. An initial study must be published for 20 days. Most often it's 30. And then if comments are raised after the circulation period by members of the public or any agencies, we deal with them, we address them, and we bring them before you. Ultimately, the ND comes before you to be adopted and recommended to the council. Similarly, for the EIR, the main difference here is that at the front end, we're required to do a notice of preparation telling the agencies and the world that we're preparing an EIR on such and such a project. And we often have a public scoping meeting. The point of those is to solicit input into the analysis from agencies and the general public. Then we go through the same process with the tech studies. We do our admin reviews. We get the EIR ready for prime time public circulation. That must be posted publicly for 45 days. And the other big difference here is we are required to respond in writing to all the comments that are received during that period. And so you see those come before you in the final EIR documents. And then along with that, we also prepare a mitigation monitoring and reporting program, which is usually a matrix table document that kind of shows how the city is going to follow up and commit to these mitigation measures. And then again, that all comes before you to be certified and recommended. CEQA requires us to analyze the project as proposed and based on the detail that we have. And so we often have bigger picture documents on general plan updates and precise plan. We have a lot of precise plans in Mountain View. And so those analyses are more broad brush. And then versus say a 100-unit townhome project where we have engineered plans, that's a very fine-grained site-specific analysis. CEQA, I wanted to mention this situation because we use it a lot in Mountain View where we tier. CEQA encourages tiering, not reinventing the analysis every time. Although it seems like we do these over and over, I know, but the idea is you can take an analysis done for a broad project like a precise plan, that's been all disclosed, and then follow-on projects within that precise plan that come forward can do a more focused, narrow analysis that incorporates the big picture stuff and just focuses on what's important to that site or what's unique to that project. This is a good thing for the city because it also limits the legal exposure and the attack points on the environmental analysis. The stuff that's been disclosed already is not really reopened in most cases. We're focusing again on the new stuff. So go ahead. Another dense one for you, but we wanted to mention some of the types of tiering documents that you've seen and will continue to see here, where we use conformance checklists. Again, a lot of these look very similar. They look like an initial study. They go through the checklist questions. This one is done to document that follow-on project just fits under the umbrella of the big picture analysis. There's really no change. So it's showing our work. There's no public circulation required for that. Similar but slightly different is an addendum. That follow-on project is making a small change or is doing something a little different or adding a slight piece of property that's next door. And so there's some changes needed to the analysis, but really we're going through the same kind of document to show that we've thought through it. There's no ramifications, no new environmental impacts. And again, that does not require circulation. You see them as part of the resolutions in the file, but there's no public involvement necessarily. If we do have a follow-on project, and you just saw this with Middlefield Park and North Bayshore, we have a precise plan and we had two big projects coming forward under each of those, which we're implementing a large portion of them. They had new impacts. They had impacts, and we wrestled with this air quality stuff. I'll touch on that in a second. Those ones you have to go through an EIR process again when you have a significant impact that's new. You must go through the EIR process, but the document can be focused on just those new issues for the most part. I'm trying to go quick here. I have a lot of material. So in terms of some other thoughts that have come up or things to think about that we think about and wrestle with, CEQA requires us to evaluate the project at the baseline conditions. We can't really make a developer or an applicant go back and fix the sins of the past. So sometimes we mitigate just back to where it was, and maybe that's not the greatest, but that's what we have to do. There's no opinion or suggestion for you on what to decide. It's just the environmental facts as we know them in accordance with the state guidance and the city's guidance in terms of the thresholds and the approach. which the thresholds for CEQA can be a controversial thing because they're looking citywide. These are adopted thresholds and guidance from the state. They're kind of looking citywide, big picture, 30,000 foot level. So I might stand here at a hearing and tell you that the impact of noise is less than significant according to the thresholds, and if the applicant is going to adhere to the city's standard conditions, but the person who lives next door thinks very differently about that. And so that can be a source of frustration for a lot of stakeholders. But we have to kind of do this based on the guidance that we have. Mitigation measures are in the documents. I mentioned those. They're a little more rigid than conditions. They have to be proportional, and there has to be an essential nexus between the impact and the mitigation, and they're specific to that impact. We can't just heap on things for a very small impact because we want them. Another point I mentioned very quickly is deferral of mitigation is a big legal issue for CEQA. We have to be very careful with that. We always are, especially with these program level documents where we're prescribing mitigation. We have an impact, we need to mitigate it, but we might not know all the details. And so I'll use the noise one again. We have a noise impact. We need to prescribe what the levels are what the mitigation is to get it down to a certain level, but we don't have a site plan yet for that other piece, and we don't know everything. So we have to prescribe as best we can what the performance standards are and when those things are going to happen. So you'll see that in some of the analyses where we're trying to prescribe what needs to be done, even though we don't have all the info today. Statement of overriding considerations. I think you're familiar with these. This is one of the most important tenets of CEQA is that you can do it anyway, right? We prepare the EIR, we have significant unavoidable impacts. The city can say, yes, but we're going to approve this project anyway. And that's perfectly fine. This is, again, just about daylighting the decision-making. So the statement of overriding considerations, when it's needed, is in the resolution that comes before you. And it basically says, yes, we know the project has A, B, and C, and D impacts, but it's going to do all these wonderful things for the city, and we're going to go forward with it. These are some just quick technical issues. I won't spend too much time. I won't take too much time tonight, but these technical issues are the ones that I'm seeing most often as becoming big focal points on our projects, especially air quality. I talked about that. We've been wrestling with that a lot. That's really a function of the fact that the analyses and the modeling requirements and the thresholds for BACMed are getting more and more complicated and specific. And they're trying to improve air quality in the Bay Area, and I'm going, that's fine. We also are doing a lot of infill development that's next to other people. And we happen to have a few large ones of those. And so we've really been working through that issue on a few projects. Hazardous materials, we always want to be careful what we're putting where. And if there's excavation, these other ones, transportation, noise, trees, you're all very familiar with. I think those schools is one that I was going to mention as a frustrating one that just came up a couple weeks ago again, where the law is very explicit as to that is the mitigation we can require under CEQA. That's it. And so we know that costs have skyrocketed, and I would like to see that fee amount updated or the law change to be updated, because the school districts are always saying that's not enough, but our hands are sort of tied. So anyway, that's one that we often are struggling with these days. The last thing I wanted to say was just I think all of our goal, the nice thing about this is the staff, me, you, we all, the consultants that we work with, our entire goal is to make sure that CEQA is done appropriately and correctly so that the city can use it, decide, and we can hold up against any challenges. So happy to be a resource for you. And if there's questions after the next part, I will hear. Eric, is it going back to you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to say a couple of little things, just kind of bringing it back together, and then I'll be followed by RT to kind of close the conversation here. Thank you for your patience. This has been a long conversation. We're looking forward to the conversation to come. Just kind of bringing it back to the EPC rule, and I want to go back to one of the first slides that you saw from Ms. Panoyar, is this the EPC sees quasi-judicial projects and legislative projects. Guidance for the EPC here is that quasi-judicial, you're acting as a judge. It's an up-down decision. It's not a legislative process where you're pushing and pulling and providing that kind of qualitative feedback. And you're providing that input within the bounds of existing law and policy. So if there is a no, and you're confronted with a quasi-judicial project, you have to provide those specific findings. What standards does it not meet and why? Legislative, there's a lot more opportunity for the EPC to provide that qualitative input to City Council. Now, of course, this is all within the bounds of council policy. A lot of times, council is setting the framework for the project from the outset, but the council is seeking EPC's input on the best ways to kind of craft that policy or those standards. Of course, there are other constraints that we'll be telling you about. Things need to be consistent with the general plan, state law, and other inputs. Of course, we always try to structure our conversations, our legislative conversation, going from broad to narrow, getting input on the big issues first, and then narrowing down over time as we work through these projects. So why the EPC? Why do we bring these things to the EPC? We want to elevate, get exposure to large projects, get more public exposure to projects. The EPC also provides a lot of input for legislation, not just the legislation that you're working on, but as you're reviewing projects, it can inform future legislation as well, even if it's just even if it's a quasi-judicial decision that you're looking at. As the city considers what responsibilities to give to the EPC, we always have to, of course, balance these ideas of streamlining and predictability. And so all of this is a work in progress, and we're always trying to get to improve it as we improve our codes and we improve the process of the EPC. But in light of that work in progress, I'm gonna tee it over to RT for some final thoughts on communication.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Commission. I'm delighted to be here. We think one of the fundamental tenets of this process is our relationship, the staff and commission relationship. And I wanted to talk about three key things that I want us all to keep in mind, and for us to get input from you as you deliberate and talk about this. The first is just meeting process and procedure. Sorry, I have to keep taking this off because I only need it for reading. The code and the council and the community rely on the planning commission for certain matters that come before them. And you rely on us to give you the best information possible so you can make that decision. So meeting process and procedures are very important because the commission is required to consider the matter at hand. The community is trying to follow. I think to the extent that the process is very clear, it helps the community understand how these various decisions fit into the big framework of city decision-making, and it's complex. You might have a huge project with different bodies taking part in it, right? And it's very important for us to make it very clear to the community about what we're doing here collectively. So that's important. The second is, and I'm asking, and we're asking, we talked about this, we've got areas where we feel like we would like the EPC for help. And I'll outline some of these for you. Because I think a good staff commission relationship is built on that mutual trust, respect, and communication. Obviously, and we have our commission do this, we want you to review all the materials and come prepared to the meeting. Ask questions of staff, ideally in advance, so we can be prepared. Eric's here, we're here, just calls and an email. And we're happy to walk through. I know that we don't have a whole lot of time to answer a whole lot of questions. And that's part of our job, which I'll talk about next. So do ask us, because I think the more preparation we can have, the more information we have ahead of time, we can bring a better response to you, a more prepared response. And that I think is going to be helpful to you, to the communities watching, and to us, frankly, because sometimes we're not able to come up with all of the facts and information at the meeting. So that's what we request of you. It can be very distracting, and this happens with all bodies, including us, when the staff level review. There's a lot of voices, there's a lot of input. And we can help. And I think for the commission to focus on the big picture, on the matter at hand, explain to the community, and we can help there too, what it is that you are doing. Because I think a lot of members don't quite understand the process. And for us to all follow it makes it simpler and easier for them to understand how are these processes put in place? How does the city go about making all of its deliberations? So I think that's very important. And part of our job is to help you and the chair be prepared for it. And when you give us the questions ahead of time or say, hey, we heard about this, we just want to make sure that you can put it into perspective, that's going to be helpful to you, right? So focusing on the matter at hand. Obviously, as we talked, following the ordinance and the law, very often these are quasi-judicial decisions, or there might be specific law that says we have to approve this because of this, or here are the mitigations and here's the nexus, right? It's very, very important. And sometimes it's important to explain to the community who might show up and not understand why, right? So that's, I think, important as well. If there's a disagreement or you don't understand why a certain recommendation is made, or a particular conclusion that staff has come to, feel free to ask. The more time we have to prepare, the better the answer is going to be. But just ask, and sometimes I think that's helpful. Very often we might have a commissioner say, hey, I might bring up this question because I think it's important for the community to hear. It would be good if you prepare a response for it. And I think that's going to be very helpful. And then before approving an application, I think the commission and staff goes through this. We go through some of these. We have to answer the following questions in the affirmative. Is it consistent with the general plan? Is it consistent with the precise plan and the applicable requirements? Are the environmental impacts reduced or eliminated? Is the environmental document appropriate? And then is the final decision and recommendation supported by findings of fact and substantial evidence? And I think to the extent that it's articulated, sometimes things can get a little complicated when you've got different voices. It's important for the commission, and we can help explain why the commission is making a certain decision. So overall, I think that's the help, and that's what the commission can bring to this process. And I ended with, I think, almost the biggest part: how can staff help? And we want to hear from you. What we try to do, quite frankly, is it's our job to prepare the background information, the research, the findings, make it very, very clear, going step by step by step, as you heard, going through the process to help the commission make its decision. Very often there will be studies attached. We try to make it helpful because they can be a bit dense with executive summaries and conclusions. Our tables contain assumptions so that it's very clear to find them. And as we hear from you, we try to go back and do a better job next time. So I think that communication is going to be very helpful. What I would say is good communication with us and how you can be more effective is going to be very helpful to us. Other responsibilities that we have, orienting new commissioners, we notice meetings, we respond to requests for information, we highlight key issues and data, or if an issue comes up, we might confer with the chair and say, hey, this new issue came up. Feel free to ask us, we'll prepare something for you because it's something that had not been anticipated. And we post it, of course. So we try to do as much prep as early as possible, as soon as we get information, so that you're not surprised with any new information. And then finally, I would say, I was going to speak a little bit about the application review, but a lot of it has been kind of explained to you. And in addition to that, I think we are here to help you strategize. If you are looking for some help on addressing a particular issue, we're here to help you work through the process so the commission can arrive at a conclusion that they can support. So I wanted to end with that, just thank you. And I hope that kind of rounds out the discussion and helps you deliberate and give us whatever feedback that you'd like to give us about the process. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Thank you everyone for doing that and taking the time. So just before we get into the deliberation, we'll take the public comment, get that taken care of, and then we can jump into our discussion. If any member of the public online would like to provide comment on this item, please click the raise hand button in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Phone users can mute and unmute themselves with *6. And the EPC clerk will press the timer and let you know when your time is up.
We have two
We do have
speakers that
Okay.
wish to talk. So the first one is Cliff Chambers. Cliff, we are ready to speak now.
Thank you very much. I'm Cliff Chambers, and I'm speaking for myself tonight, but I'm very active with the Mountain View Coalition for Sustainable Planning. We have regular interface with several advisory bodies to the City Council, including the Environmental Planning Commission. And we're having a discussion at one of our upcoming monthly meetings on how to make advisory bodies more effective in advising the City Council to achieve their very ambitious work plan objectives. And we think there's definitely room for improvement, and I really look forward to hearing from you this evening. We regularly comment on development proposals, both before the EPC and the City Council. And one thing we've noticed is that often the EPC only reviews projects very late in the approval process. And I made the point in a letter that I sent earlier today that I think there's opportunities perhaps in the pre-entitlement process, like we do with MVCSP, with having discussions with the developer early on in their development where they provide input, we provide dialogue. And I've often thought that there's more opportunity for the EPC to have something similar happen. The time spent tonight, I really want to focus on what I was hoping that the EPC would do is to review some of the purview that they have in the Municipal Code 364410, where the development agreements are not part of your purview. We've just gone through the experience with the Google North Bay Shore Master Plan, and that document, after I had a chance to review it, had significant issues. I felt at a policy level that it would have been very good for the Environmental Planning Commission to review. And I'll just give you one example. In the original draft of the development agreement, it allowed Google to unilaterally make changes to the phasing plan so that they could, in the original, have an opportunity to pursue office without any residential. There was changes made after provided input that any permit, whether residential or an office building, would go forward. But I think there's just a lot, and there's a lot of changes that needed to be made in order for us to support the master plan, which we've supported and we've been involved for literally 15 years in the precise plans, et cetera. The development agreement itself is very important to the decision-making process, and we really welcome your discussion, if you so inclined, to see if you agree with MVCSP that it should be part of your review process and changing the ordinance to allow that as part of, at least for major projects, you can set the threshold. So thank you very much, and I really look forward to hearing your discussion tonight. Thank you.
And the next person is Bruce England. Bruce, you're okay to talk now.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair and Commissioners, for having this important meeting tonight. Bruce England, Wisman Station Drive. I would like to first off echo what Cliff just said. I'm also a longstanding member of MVCSP, and I also manage the Green Spaces Mountain View group and the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition Mountain View local team. And as Cliff said, not only MVCSP, but these other organizations too, we monitor projects through the whole process. So that includes EPC, of course, and also includes DRC, ZA, the other advisory bodies, the council committees, and also interfacing with staff and developers and all that, leading up ultimately to council approval of projects when it goes to that point. And the better equipped the advisory bodies are to review projects, the better we members of the community who are participating in these processes are going to be able to do the work that we do as, members of the community. And as was pointed out, including the DA review in EPC processes is part of this. It's part of that robust process of your being able to look at all the material that's relevant to your deliberations on the various projects. But also, the more that we can be heard through city processes, when we submit letters, when we make comments at meetings and things like that, the more that our input can be taken into account, the better. And so, as you know, when you get your packets for your meetings, members of the public also get that material to look at. And so it isn't just, in this case, the DA that you would see it, but that we would be able to see it in a timely manner too. And that's everything. That's all of the material that's relevant should appear in the packet in a way that the community can do their part to help you and everybody else out with reviewing these important projects that are coming before us all to look at. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hank. Is there anyone else online?
No, that's all the speakers.
All right, thank you very much. So now that public comment is over, I will take it to the EPC deliberation and discussion. I did want to say thank you again for taking the time to have this retreat. I think it helps a lot. There haven't been a lot of occasions and opportunities for us to get together. There's something about just being in this room versus the council chambers also that just feels a little bit less formal, a little more casual, where we can just talk. And even though I've been on the EPC for a while, I'm not one of the newest members. I found that the information helped me and in trying to craft to get what we were going to discuss at the retreat today. I thought it was a good lineup, and I'm familiar with the development review process from a professional standpoint, and still having it laid out as an EPC member helped me. So I'm sure it has probably initiated some questions, which was going to be great, and some further discussion. But one thing I will say, and usually I don't address the public comments directly, but it's interesting because after we got the letter earlier from Mr. Chambers, and I was thinking about, Eric, what you had just said about the quasi-judicial and the ministerial and the discretionary different categories. It became clearer to me even that there are certain levels at which we are examining what's before us. And it wasn't that clear to me even before. So sorry, the world out there, after years of being on the EPC, it wasn't super clear to me what each of those meant necessarily and how we were approaching each project when they came before us. So that helped a lot. But in regards to what Mr. Chambers had wrote, I thought it was an interesting thought. Commissioners might want to talk about that, but then I wanted to find out, is that something we could even do, given that this is the topic of the day anyways? Like, what is in our purview to discuss? One, not as important, but today's intention is to talk about, internal processes and how we can, function as EPC, the board, and how we can help council. Despite the interesting idea that was presented by the public, I don't know that we are even able to, because it wasn't noticed as such, to discuss that. And even more importantly, I think that because it would change code and how we do things in the city, and staff, you can confirm whether or not this is true, that we wouldn't even be able to make that change even if we discussed it today. So Eric, back to what I was mentioning earlier, when you brought up the fact that we could affect future legislative issues, I think it was great that public had brought this up because in the housing element discussions to come, I think there is a chance to look at that process and give public input and for us to have discussion on that process itself. And it would be great if we knew when that was, and that way the community at large could be noticed and have that input. But tonight, unfortunately, I'm afraid you guys tell me, confirm that that's not even something we could really even discuss competently. And I just want to put that out there and let you guys know. So.
Well, I'll go back to what I said about the communication part. I think we would be happy to take them in as comments, but I can't say we have responses to those right now. We'll be able to take them in as comments, for example, about the DA, right? If there are comments, we'll take them in, but I can't now respond to, how to go about making changes or whether or not to make changes. That was not the matter that we had agendized for discussion.
I mean, even specifically, even talking about the EPC and whether or not, right, we could even get a look at the DA earlier. That is part of the process that has been established and voted on public, or that the city has, that would take a much larger conversation.
It would take a much larger conversation. I would say it's outside of what we had agendized for discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So I would focus the commission on the agenda, and then if carve out a couple of minutes if each commissioner had a comment or something to say, and then we'll take that in as a comment. But tonight is not a night to make recommendations or decisions. It was just a conversation and an informational session.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. So just to put that out there so everyone is understanding how the format is going to go. All right. Well, I know that people had questions about what was presented. And so if we want to just go ahead and start with those questions, that would be great. Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to this team, to the staff for providing all this information. I think it's sometimes when you look at retreats like this, we've all been through so many. It's like, oh man, I don't know. But having been here before for 1 year and then going through the reappointment process to fill out the 4 years of this new term, this is very helpful, not just for me, but I think for the community as a whole, because they can then see this is the step-by-step process that you all have to adhere to, right? And so when things are presented a certain way on the agenda for certain projects, now we know the correlation to that, right? The A with the A, the B with the B, and so that all makes more sense. So I don't have that many questions, but the one question I do have, which I think is important, is in terms of the initial study, when you look at that and you look at a housing proposal or a development proposal, but specifically housing related, I saw a bullet point targeting transportation. So here's my question for you. I was a little confused on that one because I'm not sure if that also encompasses an analysis of like traffic, the impacts of what traffic could be within the scope of the said project. Do you all factor that into that as well? Or is that something separate? Or how is that even related to what we do?
I'll start with a pretty high level overview because there's all transportation and traffic come into the process in a bunch of different ways. We also have a representative from Public Works, Ms. Renee Gunn, who could get into any more details if you want to go there. But really, the review of transportation happens at, like I said, many different levels. At the CEQA level, under recent state law, we're very limited into how we can actually review transportation. The guidance from the state now is that transportation impacts is really vehicle miles traveled. And so traffic impacts, what we traditionally think of as traffic congestion, is no longer a consideration under CEQA. However, we have this city process we call the multimodal transportation analysis. And that's where we really look at performance of local facilities and intersections and whether improvements need to be done to local facilities and intersections. There's also a project level review that happens where we look at the interaction of different modes on the project site, how pedestrians access the site, vehicle safety and things like that as well. So that's the very high level. I don't know if Ms. Gunn wants to add anything.
I think I would just add, it is really a multimodal transportation analysis. It's not just vehicles, miles, it's not just LOS and intersections. When we no longer had LOS underneath CEQA and we came up with this new process, the MTA process, we really wanted to incorporate reviewing the pedestrian improvements, the bicycle improvements, the mass transit improvements that could happen with a project. And so we're looking at all modes of those transportation improvements. And when the project is big enough, we do look at LOS. And there are times when projects do meet thresholds that BTA makes us look at LOS. And so we still do follow all of those.
Great.
And I could, sorry, tack on one important point. So while CEQA no longer considers, say, a signal or traffic congestion as an impact, it's still the project's responsibility to do an upgrade or do some kind of improvement if it's triggered. So it's not that it's just because it's removed from CEQA doesn't mean the project doesn't have to address any impacts. It just means that those impacts are being addressed through the project conditions as opposed through CEQA. So it's just changing where it lives, but ultimately the project applicant is still responsible for doing those improvements.
Awesome. And then my second question, if I may, is or focuses in more on what's the word? I forgot the word. I'm so sorry. Let's go back to my final question, which would be number 3. If I remember to, I'll let you know. If I'll just maybe email you. But here's the question. I thought in the beginning when I joined, I know there was a time to be able to submit questions ahead of time. And I thought the process then had stopped. So are we able to send in questions? And if so, do we just send them straight to you, Eric, or who do we send it to?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, the process that we used to have was where you would provide comments by a certain date or a certain time, and we would provide you with written answers, questions, and then we would provide written answers, thank you, before the meeting. For several reasons, staffing reasons, as well as other reasons, we were not able to provide the written answers. We still really encourage you to provide questions. So if you can provide those, send them to me by all means. And if, for whatever reason I'm not involved or not there that day, I'll have you send them to somebody else, or I'll be monitoring them and forwarding them to the right people. And we want to be prepared at the meeting so that, and part of the goal of having the questions ahead of time and being able to respond at the meeting is so that we can have those questions be part of the discussion at the meeting, which is the kind of the whole point of the commission's deliberation as well. So definitely encourage you to provide questions ahead of time. Please don't expect written answers before.
Awesome. And just for clarification's sake, it's just a one-off email from the individual commissioner.
Absolutely.
Just like that. There's no CCing of anybody else. It's just individually.
Send it to me. That's all fine. Yeah, I'll take care of it.
I was scolded for not copying Sandy on my questions.
Oh, okay. Feel free to copy Sandy.
Maybe I just ask questions that she needs to
I will send them to Sandy. Don't worry. But feel free to copy Sandy.
Well, Eric should have been scolded.
That's right. It was not.
Send it, Eric.
Then I'll just add then to highlight it and daylight that to public, then during the discussion when we're up at the dais, do we then just say, I had this question and this was the answer provided, staff, is that correct? Is
Well,
that the way to
I
do it?
don't
Or
think-
do you adjust the staff report a little bit, or how you present?
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways. One is if we think it's a question from everybody, we will address it in our presentation.
Mhm.
But sometimes you might say, I might bring it up, and you might just ask staff the question. Then we'll
Okay.
answer it.
Okay, it's
So
just a
then-
matter of you having the answer prepared so that you can give a.
Well, it's a better answer, right? If you have some time to prepare. So
Yeah.
that's the point. We want to give you the best information.
Sorry, so if then we have to ask the question during the meeting, what's the point of sending it in an email?
Well,
It would be along the having lost the ability to send in questions and have those be written, the answers be written, which, to be honest, like, has more or less had the effect, whether intentional or not, of dissuading me from sending in questions, then there ought to be, in my view, some sort of middle point where staff says, and that's our staff presentation, and here are the questions that came in. We're answering them now. Like, in what ways is that not achievable?
It is achievable. My point is, if there were questions asked, then we can address them. There might be a question where we will, it might be a simple question sometimes, like, oh, how many units below market rate or something like that. We might say, oh, it's on page 7 of the staff report, in which case we may not need to address it. But if it's a question that we haven't provided information on, then surely we can. So it all depends on the question. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to jump.
No, that's okay. No, I think, yeah, in thinking out loud, I think it is useful in that because some of our projects are so complex, when we ask it right there on the dais, I've realized that sometimes I don't know the answer. I'll have to go find out from someone or hold on. If there are questions that are where the answers would help the public, help us, if we can just get it to them, even if they don't have the answer right away, they can then get a more full answer during the time that we're up there to discuss. And I think that helps the discussion itself. So that might be a big plus. Yeah, I just didn't realize that myself, okay, call me an idiot, but I'm glad we're having this conversation in general because I wasn't aware that we could just reach out and say, hey, by the way, I had this question about this. And, you know, because we're not all talking together, I don't know who else has that question. You guys will know. And you'll say, oh my gosh, we weren't clear about this. Let's put that out there. Or, okay, that's a good question. If I know you're going to ask it on the dais, then let me just prepare a better answer and have it ready just in case. So all around, I think it's a win-win. Mr. Goodyear.
Sure. So just to follow up on that, because it's a good discussion. So my previous board experience with other teams, when that would happen, we would submit questions in to the team. We would get written responses. In this case, I'm wondering, because the last year or for a certain period of time, I was under the impression that we couldn't send questions, but now I must have misunderstood. It's the written response portion that we may not get when we ask the questions. So, and if it's come up before in the minutes, I haven't seen them, and if I missed them, I'm sorry. But here's my question. When and if we were to submit questions from the team, the commissioners, and you all have them ahead of time, is the policy then, or your practice then, could it be that you could then list in the minutes said questions that were submitted by members of the commission, and then you can point to where in the presentation perhaps it was answered, or at least the questions posed by the commission, so that people can then see that follow through transparency of said commissioners submitted these questions in anticipation of being noted for discussion at the deliberations that we're a part of. Does that make sense?
Maybe you can answer what minutes are for, but yeah.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I will say that we went through a process probably about 10 or 12 years ago where the minutes have been kind of less detailed. And I think it used to be that a lot of minutes were just verbatim, like every word that was said was written in the minutes. That actually, I think, it is actually less accessible to people because you're using the minutes to really get key information about the event, right? About what got approved, was anything added to the approval, and who spoke. And, when you have to go through a 30-page document in order to find that information, it's actually less accessible. We do have recordings of everything. It's all on YouTube and Legistar and all of these other resources. And I believe even on Legistar, you can kind of click the item and you'll go straight to where that is in the agenda. And so I would encourage people to use that if they're looking for, what was the discussion around a particular question.
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing is that there wouldn't be an option to then list out the questions that were submitted. So in the end, folks won't know whether or not any of us submit a question.
Well, I think the point of this is to make sure that questions are submitted to provide more information. And so the intent is, and we would flag this in our discussion, this wasn't in the staff report, but we want to highlight this for the commissions, you know, or in our presentation, we might say that, right? And that's there. But I don't think the intent was this commissioner submitted this question, or that commissioner submitted that. It's more about, is there more information that would help DPC make their decision? And that's really the intent of our presentation.
I completely understand. We just have different viewpoints.
Can I add something to that? So my understanding, right, is that the EPC's like role is to be the prior to council, maximal to the best extent possible, stop for public transparency, feedback, and input, right? And so then it would seem to me like the questions that any individual commissioner, certainly collectively, the commissioners have regarding a project or any other kind of like change within the purview of the discussion on the agenda is in some sense important to the public trust, right? Or at least is entrusted through the city council appointments as part of the process that ensures that development happens within what is the city trust, right? Yep. And so then it would seem to me like those questions are of public importance. And so for me, this kind of like process of deformalizing something that is linked to what the public trust is did feel like a loss. And so to the extent that I'm agreeing with Commissioner Gutierrez, and also not necessarily, you know, like faulting anything or anyone for like, you know, we were just talking about the vacancies in terms of like staffing, right? So like, I can understand that there are practical considerations here in terms of staff's ability to deliver on things like this. But it just seems to me like the deformalizing of a previously what felt like an inherent part of transparency, that does feel like a loss. And so I don't agree that it has been a net benefit, either in our ability to like actually have an informed discussion during the meetings, or to the public trust or transparency, I should say, to have that be part of the process that has gone away.
I'm gonna just,
Yeah, one last question. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. So I think the workaround, there's a workaround. And I think the workaround is instead of having us depend on our team to help us with that, because the minutes from their perspective has evolutionized during the last 12 years, right? And I can understand that. Then perhaps we can just avoid that by just presenting the questions that we've emailed in once we've done that to the team as part of what we discuss when we have our questions at the moment here with this board, right? And then that way we can say, well, just for transparency's sake, prior to this discussion, I've sent in the following questions. And we have to factor that into our conversation tonight. And these are the questions. And that was it.
my assumption in general is that we're trying to daylight more so that, and also to get better answers while we're up there, because we only have a limit of time. And then, I don't know about you guys, once it gets really late, sometimes the brain activity just slows down a bit, and I want to be as sharp as possible. So if we can just condense things, not take away content, but get to the meat in the nitty gritty quicker, I think we'll all be more effective in discussing the pertinent items and getting through more of them. Because sometimes I walk away from the meetings and I'm thinking, there are 3 more things I wanted to discuss, but I just didn't get there. So I think if we have questions prepared for staff or things that we were thinking of, but we aren't clear, and we just let them know, this is what we're wondering, then when we get up there, they'll have the answers more readily and faster. And you can just ask them there. Even, you know what I mean? So it doesn't take away from content. It doesn't take away from even who asked what. It really is just a matter of allowing them to have the answers faster and more thoroughly. I think that's the main crux of this particular item. If you're comfortable with that, then.
It sounds like that's what it is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, this is great. This is why we're having this discussion, just to. Okay, success. All right. In general, just bringing things up and being able to flesh it out. I believe you. Yeah, sorry.
No,
Commissioner
well,
Niemeyer.
first I'd like to say I've gone through many of these retreats and this was so helpful. Every time I hear this content, I think it reframes the work that we're doing. And you saw my daughter in here earlier and she's asking like, what does this body do? And I think one really important takeaway from this conversation is framing how we approach the different types of meetings. And when I started on the commission, we used to have study sessions in this room, right? And there was a signal like, this is kind of a working session, like we're really digging into it. And that was a powerful signal as I was kind of figuring out, okay, what kind of meeting is this versus something else? And so I appreciate that the staff reports are really explicit in saying, this is the action that's required. I hear what you're saying about kind of EPC being that really robust opportunity for public comment, but I've been thinking a lot about our meetings and trying to figure out how do we describe our purview, right? Like how do we really say like, what can we do and what are adjacent issues that are really important, but we might not have that jurisdiction. And so what I found, and I want to be responsive to what I think I'm hearing, is capturing the nature of that conversation. And I think we've been pretty effective at when we give our feedback to staff, we say, we want to characterize like, generally support this project, but here are the big areas of discussion. And that's how when I've looked at council staff reports, they seem to be pretty responsive to that. I will say I feel like as kind of a longer serving member, I know I ask a lot of basic questions all the time, and I certainly don't need those daylighted to staff. So I think if we want in having the conversation publicly and say, you know, I submitted this question in advance, like I would just encourage commissioners to do that voluntarily, as opposed to saying like, we're gonna share all of the questions that were received, because a lot of mine are clarifying, like, can you do this or that? So I don't know, I see that there's value in attributing it, but I want to make sure that we recognize that our staff, I would love, my question to you really is about like the proportion of your work that isn't EPC, right? Because I know that we see you on a Wednesday night and you've done a ton of preparation, but we all have lives and jobs outside of this. And I just try and be respectful of the time that you all are putting into this, because it's not insignificant to prepare for these meetings. And I think seeing those vacancy statistics makes me very anxious for the city, right? Like we want to keep good staff. We want to have really thoughtful planning. And we do that by having a functional relationship with our staff so that it doesn't feel adversarial and it doesn't feel like there's a gotcha question or something at the end. And so I think that's what I think the purpose of this is to recognize where can we better communicate when we're having questions, so that these guys who have probably sat through a council meeting right, the night before, had other commitments, aren't scrambling and able to, you know, get the information that we want to make better decisions. So, yeah, just be helpful. Like I know Eric, you are our designated staff, but I'm sure like in terms of EPC as percentage of your workload, like, I mean, there's probably a lot more we don't have visibility into.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it obviously depends on the item. And I think, you know, there's so much work that comes from other people who are presenting it, you know, so it's, you know, I think I can't possibly put a percentage on how much I do, but yeah, it's you know, it definitely depends on the items that we're bringing forward. You know, some of them are more, you know, have a lot more work behind them. That's for sure.
Well, I know there are more questions, so I'm gonna let Vice Chair Dempsey ask, and then we'll come to, yeah, and then down the line.
Yeah, so I had a question that's off this particular topic, but maybe I'll just opine for 30 seconds on the topic and then I'll hopscotch over. This has not been an area that's been too difficult for me, in that I find that I ask, you know, a mixture of questions where I get a good substantive answer and I'm like, oh, we need to talk about this at the hearing. And then there's a lot of questions where I'm like, oh, I'm such an idiot. Why did I ask you that? And Eric's like, it's in the staff report. Like, I don't need that. That doesn't need to go out to the public. But it's actually worked pretty well for me. Like if I've got a substantive question. You give me a good answer that I think is interesting. I'm like, yeah, I'll ask this again tonight if you don't end up covering it voluntarily in your presentation. And I think that system's worked pretty well. And it definitely gets a better answer if I tell you a day in advance that I'm going to ask it. And so I've actually been really happy with how that's worked. So for what it's worth. If it's okay, I wanted to ask a couple questions just about the matrix study. I'm really excited about the matrix study. I was nerding out as you were talking about it. I love it. I absolutely love it. I think it's such a great thing that you were doing it. I'm excited to see more of the details about it, to see some of the results that come out of it. And actually, that was part of what I wanted to ask about. First off, did you benchmark against any other like neighboring or relatively equal sized cities?
Yeah, so some of the assessment that Matrix does is based on best practices from this region or from the state. So they do look a little bit more globally or broader.
How did we stack up?
Depends on the area, like this particular item. How much we get feedback about our processing timelines, we're actually not that different than a lot of our adjacent cities that are similar in size. There are ways we're worse in certain categories or types of permits than others, and there's others where we're better. So I think part of this study, we're really trying to look at it all collectively. See what we can do.
One of the things I'm sure you've shared publicly some documentation on the matrix study and some of what you found, I assume.
Yeah, so the report is actually, and I think we might have linked it in the memo, but we have a webpage dedicated to the actual report itself and all the detailed recommendations. And then this summer, as part of our new website, pages that we're developing, we'll also have more information about where we're at with all of each of the recommendations. So that will also be on a webpage that we're developing as well.
Cool. Yeah, I think what I would end up asking for, I guess what I would love to be able to do is, just periodically have you just tell us like, hey, here's how we're tracking on the core metrics that we laid out for what we think is important, like our response times and whatnot. I love dashboards. I think dashboards are really useful tools. And so my ask would be, I think it would be really useful for us to periodically just hear kind of what our core metrics are, like how we're doing as a city. That would be really valuable for me because then it's a little easier for us to go, oh, wait, something's clearly wrong. We're not tracking the right way. What's going on, guys? That's really valuable, at least to me. I'd be very excited about that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I'll just add on to, so part of what the Matrix study recommended is that we do specific outreach with the development community, so our regular developers that we work with. So we did start off with our first meeting late last year. And actually that was one of the comments we heard from them as well, is this ability to see our performance. I'll call it performance metrics for lack of a better word. And so we will be pursuing, the technology that supports like the dashboard type, framework and having that stuff available online. A lot of it's tied to us getting a land management system, which whether it's embarrassing or not, we do not have here, and a lot of our adjacent cities do. And what a land management system does, for those not familiar with it, it's a very robust system that it uses GIS as the backbone, so everything can be pinpointed to particular properties and addresses, and then allows us to connect all of our permitting information, business license information, pretty much utility billing, anything under the sun. We can tie into this system and everyone in the city can see it and have universal access. It also allows us to potentially have public interfacing pages on websites with information about properties. So that is something we are going to be kicking off, but that process is like a 3-year process to implement that. And as part of that, a dashboard component is something that could come out of that as well. So I think it's definitely something we're interested in pursuing and having available.
That's wonderful news. And to the extent that part of what we were talking about tonight is purview, I think one of the places where, our purview can be helpful is when it comes to some of the process stuff, because we can draw attention to places where we're getting stuck or where we have external problems or whatever. But that's a place where I hope you might invite us in more, because I think hopefully we can be helpful, because I think it's important. But bravo, by the way, bravo City of Mountain View for all the work that y'all did to get this far. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Should I just do a few and then come back and go for it? Do you really get 80 people in the room?
Zoom. It's a Zoom room.
Oh, that's a gallery.
Chatting with her, 80 to 100.
Yeah, it depends on the staffing.
So part of the community feedback that we got is one of the things that I struggle with is you talked about SB 35 and 330 and the permit streamlining. It seems like the state, in an effort to move everything faster, is in fact making it harder to get more comment on things earlier. Can you mentioned SB 35 and SB 330 has three things. I know it was a bill to extend SB 330 and SB 35, but can you talk about what's the maximum number of meetings that are allowed? And under the permit streamlining process, is that, what is that? So, I mean, the committee says we want EPC to look at this. Well, that seems to me like that might be a touch point that now we actually can't do. So can you help me understand what we can do within the law? What reviews are permitted? Because like DRC counts as a meeting, ZA counts as a meeting. Help me understand, maybe, I don't know if you have a chart that shows what meetings are allowed and what aren't, and are they different for SB 35 and 330 and the permit streamlining process?
Well, I'll start. I'm sure other people can fill in more of the details. There is a 5-meeting limit for residential projects. I believe it's under SB 330 and not. So 5-meeting limit, and that 5-meeting limit shot clock, if you will, starts at project completeness. So once a project has submitted a complete application. So one of the ways that we get efficiency is we do some neighborhood meetings and DRC meetings, things like that, before the project has even submitted a complete application. So that's all during the kind of assembly of information phase of the project. So we can get input and have these public meetings and this conversation and this iteration even before the 5-meeting shot clock starts. Once the project is complete, though, there are a 5-meeting limit. Usually what that means is DRC and either EPC or ZA and council. So unless the item is continued or there's a special circumstance, we don't get to that 5-meeting limit.
Study session.
Well, the study sessions would usually happen. They would count if they were after project.
So everything that we see at a study session is not deemed complete?
Generally, that's the case, yes. I'm not saying that it's impossible that it might never happen, that you might see a study session that's a complete application. Of course, we get more flexibility with non-residential projects to do so. But I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I would just add, so the completeness factor, it's a little tricky because it's based on really oftentimes how savvy the applicant team is who's submitting, and if they're submitting and responding comprehensively, people can get there quicker than others. But I think as Mr. Anderson highlighted, we usually go to study sessions pretty early on in a project. So usually it's not a complete application at that point. I will follow up on SB 35. So that is more of a streamlined process. And for SB 35, there is no public hearing. That is the decision that's made at the community director, development director level. And so for that, there is sort of a shortened timeline to review for completeness. A lot of SB 35 is about tribal consultation, which I think maybe somebody had a question about that or not, but it introduced a mandated process for us to consult the Native American Heritage Commission and for us to send out information on the project to Native American tribes that are sort of registered in this area and see if they identify or have any concerns with this particular location being sensitive to any artifacts or other kind of characteristics that may be in this area that are sensitive to their tribal group. So we have done that, for example, on the lot 12 project right here. We did that consultation. We've done it on the other SB 35 projects as well. And so far, our communications with the tribal, consultations have been pretty straightforward. And mostly they just want to have some oversight during excavation and grading and stuff. So that process is kind of a slightly different than our other processes.
And so you mentioned the number of meetings, but how is there, sure, they have to have, those meetings have to happen within 2 days, 50 days?
For SB 35,
are there different requirements? I'm trying to understand what's the
SB 35, there are no public hearings. It's just a decision.
But I thought there were pretty severe timelines.
SB 330, there are 5 meetings. Yeah, that's.
They have to happen within a certain amount of time.
So SB 35, there is a time limit in which the city has to provide a final decision. So that one has a very quick timeline. I believe it's 90 days.
90 days.
60 days, something like 60, sorry.
Depending on the number. It's 90, it's and 180, I think, depending. So it's a very quick turnaround time to review the project and
comment.
Yeah.
And then for SB 330, it actually defaults to the Permit Streamlining Act, which the Permit Streamlining Act, aside from having the 30-day rule about the city constantly providing responses in 30 days of getting submittals, once it's deemed complete, we actually have, depending on the level of review required for under CEQA, we also have a timeline in which we have to finish the CEQA process and finish all of our documentation, depending on the level of CEQA. EIRs are given the longest timeline, CAT exempt are not, they're much shorter timelines. And then once we've completed the environmental review process, we actually have anywhere from, depending on the level of review, I believe it's anywhere from 30 to 180 days to actually act and make a decision on the whole picture of the project and the CEQA.
Hello, CEQA. Why does this exist? It seems like.
Why does CEQA exist?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what its purpose is.
Sure.
Because I'll be quite very candid with you.
Yeah.
I've raised things that to me look like a real issue, and I've been told it is staff's determination that this is not an issue, and basically I'm SOL. And so, what I heard was at the end of the day, council can say, tough, we're going to do it anyway. So why is this, what was the purpose for putting this, there had to be something behind this.
It really, and it's 50 years old now. And so really the original intent when it was enacted in 1970 was to daylight this as part of the decision process, because back then, now we have plenty of involvement, plenty of questioning, plenty of commenting, right? There's talk of CEQA reform and it being a hindrance and a hurdle. At the time it was created, there was a real outcry and a need to include this as part of the decision-making process, and for agencies to be held accountable that they were what they were doing, that they had at least thought through these issues. So that's really how it germinated. It's a very interesting, wonderful, and maddening business to be in for the reasons you just mentioned. And I use the LOS as a great example because level of service is what we hear a lot of comments about from the public and other stakeholders. That's what now we tell you, oh, that's not a CEQA issue anymore. We turn a blind eye, you could deal with that somewhere else. And so it's very frustrating in that sense because CEQA has become more convoluted and complicated over the years as the state adds more exemptions, carve outs, special situations. And so it has become a bit of what you're talking about. So I understand that, but it really did originate from wanting to disclose and identify and consider some of these issues as part of a decision-making process. That's really where it came.
Is there a rule book someplace?
Oh yeah.
By that I mean,
yes.
Staff says this is not an issue. I'm like, it is. Damn it! Show me that it's not. And so I'd love to see a little book that says, at this point, it becomes an issue and this is not, and so I can just.
I brought it just in case.
Where do I get it? Okay. I just find it very frustrating. Because I'm, in order to object, I think.
There
As
are.
you said, we have to state do a finding and print all this stuff. And so here we are in a meeting with 7 of us and we're supposed to do a finding that says, oh, we don't agree with staff. It's kind of like, right. It feels, it's been frustrating because things that I look at and say, I don't understand how this is not an issue. And you're saying to me, it's not an issue. Who says it's not an issue? And if it's all in here, I'm gonna write this down and go buy one of these things because some of these things just make no sense to me. And I noticed this is 2023. Does this come out every year?
Yeah, that's our little Bible book for our industry that comes out every year from the agency.
John will tell you there are 20 other things in addition to this book.
Right.
Yeah, if it makes you feel better. I don't think we expect commissioners to be the technical experts, you know. But what we want you to do is ask us the questions about, you know, if you've got a question about thresholds, you know, why is this reaching this conclusion? I think that's what we're here for. But we're always happy outside of a meeting when you have to make a decision, if you want more information about, you know, there are training seminars, there are things to help the commission learn more about it. But I just wanted to say, I don't think the commission should feel like they're the consultant or the technical expert who has to kind of make that technical determination. But I think it's good that you ask us the question because it can be very puzzling, you know, why the conclusion was reached.
And I wouldn't say then, you know, don't say anything. I think that's the purpose of CEQA, is to highlight it. If you have an opinion on it, please say it. That's part of what we're doing, I think. And even if it gets by 6 other members and an entire council, doesn't matter. You've got to say it. That's the role, I think. So
I'm just trying to figure out how San Francisco denies a project because it might affect the Filipino neighborhood.
Yeah.
And outside of Tulare, where there's now cities that are underwater, they determined that there was no water risk in the area where they built an entire housing development that's in a freaking lake again. And it just, they don't, it doesn't, I don't know how to evaluate when I'm reviewing an EIR and you're asking us to approve it. There are times where I go through it and say, how am I qualified to determine whether this is a good document or not? And that's ultimately my question. I look at these things and say, okay, you're saying it's not an issue. Help me understand. I don't have to, how do I say, yeah, you've done it right? Because I look at it like this makes no sense to me. And I have no, I don't want to ask you for 50 items in an EIR to go, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this. Because that's, so if there's a comment on how to improve the communications, it would be, you know, help when something seems controversial, provide more context around why that doesn't fall into a criteria within CEQA that says it's not a significant impact. Because I look at these things, I'm like, boy, that feels like a significant impact to me. And I'm not talking about the person sitting next door.
Sure.
Okay. But I just, so help me understand how to assess an EIR better. Because I more than one occasion felt like, okay, sure, I guess I should approve this, but I don't.
I think really the commissions, as a commissioner, we wouldn't necessarily be relying on you to go toe to toe with the technical experts, but more importantly, for you to understand the point of CEQA. How are these technical studies prepared, and how are the conclusions arrived at? And I think it's best done not when you're right under the gun trying to approve a project, but more as I want to go to a session to learn more about CEQA. How is this done? How are these determinations made? That might help you a little bit more, you know, understanding why these determinations are made. Because I would even say we are not the technical experts on some air quality analysis. And we're asking the same questions. And because we ask them often enough and we're in the details, we understand them better. And we can certainly help you with that. But it could start with some training on CEQA, for example, or you might be interested in air quality and you might want to go learn more about that, or the ever-changing rules that the region is coming up with. And that might help you better understand the conclusions that staff is coming to. Because it's all very methodical, it's very technical, it's very detailed. I think now they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of consultants' time, and reams of virtual pages to go through. So if it makes you feel better, we're not asking you to be the technical consultant, but I think asking us about how these conclusions are derived, what the thresholds are, I think are very, very valuable questions. And maybe Eric, we can, if you could reach out to Eric, we can point you to certain trainings. They're available now on virtual too. You don't have to drive to, Bakersfield for a training. And so it will certainly help.
John, did you have a quick?
Yeah, can I just add tack onto that just for a quick second? I would encourage that, and I would encourage, you've done this, Commissioner, a few times over the years where you have made questions like that at the meetings, and I welcome the opportunity to get up or for one of the staff folks to explain that. And there are a lot of nuances and things that have taken twisted turns in CEQA. What happens very quickly is case law determines the next pivot of how we do things. And so some of the things I think you're alluding to, where we say, well, the impact on the project is not important anymore, but it seems important. It's a big issue for the development. Those are the kinds of things I would absolutely encourage you to ask us at the meeting to clarify. I'd be happy to jump up and do that, any of us. And then we could also do a deeper dive on CEQA like this, where we get into some of the specific issues like that and go forward. But you're absolutely right. Your observation is completely true. There are lawyers, consultants, whole teams of educators that spend decades on following this and trying to keep it straight.
Yeah, and we spend a lot of money on legal consultants too, because we're asking ourselves these questions. And I would just append to John's question. Ideally, you'd let us know a little bit before, so John can be prepared.
That would be a great one. Yes, right.
Because you're right, the question might come up and go, we're hearing about this issue, but I'm reading this conclusion. We'd like you to spend a little time explaining it to us why you reached that. Very valid.
If I could just add one more thing, just kind of bringing it back to one of the early things that Mr. Schwartz said at the beginning of the call, is that one of the purposes behind CEQA is to have this interaction between professionals in state government and local government. So there is a lot of review by Caltrans, review by state agencies that really understand, groundwater contamination, and review by, different levels of professional experts. And so you're not expected to be the technical professional expert, but you are expected to witness that interaction. And it happens through letters that come in with the final EIR, and they get sent drafts, things like that. So it's not just staff saying, "Here, we promise this." It's coming from a whole interaction of different agencies and groups. And then further, I'd just like to go back to the example of VMT and LOS, which is something may not be an issue to CEQA, but it can still be an issue for the city. And we have an opportunity through the legislative, through the city council process, local legislative process, to set up, what are those local issues and what are those local standards that that live outside of CEQA. We can always continue to do that.
Next question. And I don't know if there's anybody that's here been long enough. Maybe Mr. Clark has been around long enough to answer this. The ZA in San Francisco and the Planning Commission in San Francisco are very different. The Planning Commission has much of the ministerial authority that was granted years ago to the ZA here. Why was that done?
I think I'm gonna defer that to Ms. Shavastava.
It was before you.
I'm not
Maybe you
very
were.
I'm not very familiar with San Francisco permit requirements, but I can tell you that the EPC has a very special place in Mountain View and it's very unique in the charter. And I think the city was very forward thinking. I mean, I don't know any city of our size that has 25 precise plans, to be quite frank. You know, and there's a lot of advanced planning work and long range planning work that our city does. That many agencies and jurisdictions come to us and they go, sometimes we just copy your stuff. And that's really where the EPC does its best work. And I think in recognizing that, many other commissions really don't. I mean, I know communities that may have one specific plan, if that, at which point the commission might just review conditional use permits or, you know, just simply quasi-judicial matters. But our charter and our city was set up very differently. And I think the evolution of our city and the focus on long-range planning is very heavy. And as you know, you have many items on your agenda. And I think what I'd say is the goal and the vision of the city and the APC's role in it is reflected in the charter. I can't speak for other cities. I can tell you, San Francisco is not considered the shining jewel of permit review. And so we don't. I don't think they were on the best practices list. And so I think we're always trying to strive to make sure we've got very forward-thinking, long-range planning, and we're constantly trying to balance this customer satisfaction with the need for community. And what I've seen Mountain View do, quite frankly, is do its best work with precise plans. That's where the bulk of the community input is. And I was actually on a panel of the city where they were asking me, how can you all do the kind of work you do? And I said, it's because of the forward planning. That's where the community gets involved. That's where the community vision is. That's where the community gets to see the whole plan. So when individual projects come in, there's support for it because they know that these active transportation, our parks or the grocery store are going to follow, right? And so what I want to say is Mountain View, I think, exemplifies kind of that balance. And we're able to do more things at staff level because the commission has done the heavy duty lifting of creating very robust long-range documents and helping to create them.
I'll just add real quick, there's actually quite a few cities in our region that have a similar setup. So the city of Redwood City, city of Sunnyvale, and there's one more I'm blanking out on. San Mateo, a lot of them have the zoning administrator structure as well, similar to ours. And a lot of it too is in balancing the long range with the current. Really the most sustainable way to do that is the structure we have with the ZA. And so our permit volumes, while we may not be the same size population wise as maybe the city of Redwood City or city of San Mateo or even Sunnyvale, a lot of our permit activity is the same, our volume of development. So we have very similar structures to how they're structured as well.
I guess just 2 comments. As someone who's fighting the zoning in San Francisco right now, their GIS system it's been invaluable. Okay, I can go in and find it. I can point other people to it. When I went into the planning department, they were able to pull up exactly what I was referring to. When I reached out to the board of supervisors, the assistant to the supervisor was able to find exactly what I was pointing to. And so if you want a model that works, I mean, nothing else works in San Francisco, but you can find out why they're denying your permit, no matter what the ridiculous reason is, very clearly, very quickly. So it's a good system.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's a land management system.
Yeah, they have a land management system.
Then I want to circle back a little bit to Commissioner Gutierrez's comment. So the theory is that things like YouTube replace the minutes. Put freaking bookmarks in YouTube. I don't want to have to go through a 4-hour meeting to find, oh, this topic started at 4 hours and 23 minutes into the meeting to get there. Council's even worse because they got so many different things. So, I mean, if we're going to use YouTube as a place for people to see and hear this feedback, put bookmarks in so we can see where, we can jump to the topic we're interested in quickly and actually go in and see that discussion, the questions that are getting asked, because having a 4-hour meeting as a block and you got to go forward and say, okay, what are they talking about? You got to listen to it for several minutes to even figure out what subject it is. And then you got to, okay, and it's YouTube in theory can be a replacement for the detailed minutes, but by putting it in as a single, this is the meeting, it's not accomplishing that today. So that would be
Good information to take that.
I'd support that.
more questions for now.
Thank you.
It's a different platform.
But bookmarks, at least for the agenda items,
Yeah.
like when it starts, would be useful.
There is a tool through, if you find the meeting and the media of the meeting through the agenda system, right, the Legistar agenda system, then that will take you to another module where you can do bookmarks.
That doesn't help the community.
Yeah, to his point.
That doesn't help the community. If it's somebody in the neighborhood wants to say, I want to hear what EPC talked about this topic and it was on this day, they don't have access to Legistar.
They do.
And-
Everybody does.
Not everyone knows to go through there to get it, that's all.
we can
make it
Try to
highlight
use
that.
it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll just highlight that for the public.
We'll make it more accessible. I
Yeah.
think the technology is there, but you're right, we'll make it.
Just
Yeah.
a little thing on it says, little thing on the slider that says, okay, there's the next topic. Okay.
Commissioner Clark, did you have any questions? You know, the last one who has not spoken.
You may have more.
Not,
Do that right now, we'll come back.
not questions, just comments generally. I guess there was, well, one question and it just to highlight something that's come up a few times now. And I think we discussed it around, VMT and CEQA, but there are other things that we have, just because it isn't a significant impact in CEQA doesn't mean that we're tracking it. We talked about traffic, but there are other things that, and I'm only bringing this up because the public loves to bring this up all the time, and probably with each of us individually when we're out talking to folks that, well, what about the sewer system? What about fire and police? What about, have you thought about all these things? And well, some of those are categories that are looked at in CEQA if something even has to go through CEQA review. I think, Eric, as you pointed out before, like we have our own, we're tracking cumulative impacts, and Public Works and others are thinking ahead around, okay, well, yes, this wasn't a significant impact, but we're monitoring, the pavement conditions and the traffic at these intersections. We know when we need to do signalization upgrades like we did along Shoreline and Grant Road. And so but most of those are, the broad categories I think are like, traffic. I mean, we do work with the schools on, what generation rates might be, even though we don't directly control that process. We share information, utilities, public, like those are all categories that and some of those plans actually come before us, like the multimodal planners, things that we can opine on over time and talk about. But I guess the question is, I'm right there that, we track those things over time. It's just not maybe on a project by project basis. It's more of a cumulative, what is the current status and what do we think the status will be 3 years from now based on what our precise plans and other planning documents say.
Yeah, it's actually a very multifaceted process. We just finished a series of utility master plans to kind of plan out the long-term needs for water, sewer, stormwater, things like that. I'm sure Renee can say more about that. But then we also iteratively update those as new development projects come through, and we can do that through the CEQA process because there is a utility kind of topic in the CEQA process. We can also do it outside the CEQA process. So it's this constant kind of reinforming our projections and our updates. And so it's very well planned. It's very long Longview.
Just to expand a little bit on that for the sewer and the water in particular, is that, you know, when a new project comes in through the process Ms. Hagan described, you know, it's getting routed to Public Works, to Land Development. We route it out to different divisions. We're looking at every one of those projects to determine whether or not we need to do a sewer and water capacity study. So we do those big studies with general plan, with each of the precise plans, so we can see what we're going to need to support the growth that happens in those areas. Those big studies then feed into the CIP. And then when these individual projects come in, we go, does it really match what's under the general plan and the precise plan? And our public services folks look at it too, and they know, and they have an idea of where we have problems. And if there's a project that they're like, we know we're having deficiencies in this area, or it's a place that one of those initial studies or those master plan studies have said we have problems, we do an additional study to make sure that this particular project isn't going to have negative impacts on it.
And then if it's, and that all works really well within the general plan, the precise plan process, but if there's something like a large gatekeeper project that comes through, then because then we can extract all sorts of things as part of that. So if we think they're going to break whatever existing infrastructure we have, then we can require them to put that in.
Correct.
And make sure, yeah.
Exactly. And that's true too for water supply. I know that people get really worried about, you know, oh, we're building all this housing, where's all the water going to come from? You know, we do these every few years. We do the urban water management plan, and that informs the water that we are going to need for projected development. And that whole process is iterative as well, with water supply assessments as well. So it's all very well documented and studied and engineered.
Okay, Commissioner Nunes can come around.
Thanks. So I'm also going to refer back to that matrix study. Sorry, I totally missed. I forgot the name.
Lindsay Hagan.
Second. Okay. I think as part of the slideshow, it was noted that there was 290 responses, which may imply 290 respondents. But you know, I guess my first question here is, what was like the general profile of the individuals responding to that survey? Like who were they?
So the survey went specifically out to people who listed themselves as the applicant. So that can range from a property owner. It can range to oftentimes an architect or some other contracting professional. And then we also included the property owners as well. So that survey went to both.
Yeah. And then I presume that the folks from the Matrix group would have provided, if not personally identifiable information, which obviously, right, leaving that aside, maybe like a nice pie chart saying 70% were single family homeowners, 30% were XYZ, right? Like, did they provided that?
I'd have to go back and look. I can't remember if they had people self-identify or not as part of the survey. The survey was distributed sort of and gathered anonymously, but I do think they had tracked methods.
Okay. All right. Yeah. My presumption, this is going to be, I guess, an assumption too. It would be good, you know, at some point to understand like where those responses came from. But I guess before stating my assumption, my curiosity here is with regards to like the customer service. I guess I'm just wondering like, who are the customers that take up most of like staff's resourcing, time, like attention? What is the kind of general profile of who that kind of customer is?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's mostly single family homeowners and small business owners. They take up the bulk of our time. And it's where we're trying to frame a lot of the content on our website is geared towards those parties as well.
Okay, cool. That is very helpful to know. So then in terms of kind of like other kind of thinking here, one of the, just for my general curiosity, one of the things that we noted was kind of like not just like staff availability or turnover or what have you, but I guess like just broadly speaking, like staff resourcing or resources available to the city as well. I guess I'm curious, like, is there someone, or is it typical for planning departments, community development departments, however, you know, that typical like nomenclature might go, you know, do we currently have someone who is dedicated more closely to like assessing operational efficiency and project management, not on a like application by application basis for a project, but more just like broadly speaking, you know, constantly like reviewing, analyzing, assessing, is our program being efficient? And if not, you know, here are like the recommendations. Do we have someone like that on staff, like as a dedicated role or function?
Right here.
So yeah, great question. I would say there's a couple parts to that. So one of the recommendations from the Matrix study was to create a position, in which we did, which is my position now. So part of my, I was promoted last year into this position as assistant director. My focus is really working on the development review process. So it's really working with all the departments to try and look at our processes. So I guess at the head is me, but I would say in terms of planning specifically, we have two different deputy zoning administrator positions. So one is, if folks are familiar with Rebecca Shapiro, she heads up our development review committee. And so her focus is heavily on design. She works a lot with across the whole planning team on design related things. This other role that we recently we went through a recruitment process for, and we're still going through kind of that recruitment process. This was my prior position, really is focused on supporting the planning team as a whole, working on project management skills, helping them problem solve and sort of look at processes improvement, process improvements to handouts, information online, sort of all of that stuff that's related specifically to planning is really the focus, a primary role for that position.
And this position kind of chairs the project coordinating committee and is responsible for the timelines. I think I would just say, and I have to say this because Lindsay in her role as DZA did a lot of this work of updating our application forms, making sure we got from that 57% to 94%, helping people understand timelines. And it took a lot. We've got 80 to 100 people in the process, and everyone needs to be brought along. And Renee can tell you, she's got her own work as the representative for public works. She has to coordinate with all the different departments and all the divisions in her department. So it's a very complicated process. Housing now is brought in because, you know, with some projects, if they're tearing down units, we have to then say, this is exactly the replacement unit. This is the process you go through. So it's become extremely complicated. And you're right, you know, we need somebody who's constantly watching the process. So Lindsay oversees it. The DZA in planning is the permit navigator for planning. We have a deputy building official in building, still recruiting for it, who will be responsible for the permit navigation building. And our principal engineer in public works is the permit navigator there. So Lindsay kind of oversees, and they're the biggest heavy hitters, you know. And so we have that. And then the in-team is basically to unstick and unknot problems that they can't solve, right? So we've got a very kind of a multi-pronged approach to making sure the process is smooth.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing because, you know, if it was recommended as part of like a study and, you know, you've kind of like stood up this essentially like new function and in effect helping us innovate on a, you know, like efficiency level, you know, that's definitely like, you know, props to you for that. So I guess I'm curious, you know, in terms of not necessarily, although I am curious, but around like the projected like growth in terms of this function and other ways that it's going to add value beyond what because I imagine if it's doing well, this function, right, we would want to like explore avenues to like increase or the impact and the reach of the value you're adding. But I guess like I'll just narrow it specifically to, I am wondering now going specifically to that staff like retention piece as well, how much does your role have the ability to either directly impact or if indirectly, carry through initiatives which would directly impact the side of staff retention, such as whether it may be, wages, like hours worked. I think there was like a crazy article I read about City of Los Altos in like 4-day work week or so, right? Like to what extent is the human side of, like staff and that resource in terms of the city's ability to look at these at these projects in a timely basis, to what extent does your role and function have any purview over like the human resourcing side of that?
So I would say a couple things. Some of the stuff you're hitting on about like work-life balance or ways that the city can allow us to have alternative work styles or
just as like one example,
right?
Yeah.
So we actually have an employee survey we do citywide that's managed through the city manager's office. And that's really looking holistically at what opportunities the city as an organization can support in addressing various sort of employee issues. So we have that process that we go through a survey every couple of years, and that gets assessed, and changes come out of that. So that there's that process. In terms of the department in general, I think some of the vacancies and other things, a lot of that's happening across lots of industries, not just the city, public sector. And so I think for us, I know we've been talking lately about just a lot of it's sort of how do we come back together as a team in person now that we're now functioning in this sort of telecommute world or hybrid schedule world. And so we are definitely as a department, and also we're looking to do more cross-departmental interactions and team building events and things like that, where we're getting sort of outside of our computers and looking and interfacing with each other and sort of building up that rapport again, which is really important. And I think COVID really had an impact on that. So there's sort of that piece, which, we sort of coordinate with the different divisions and departments and do that, and do team building events. Moving forward into sort of, future, the upcoming budget and other things like that, we are looking to do more cross-departmental team building, so that really if you can build a stronger team across the different departments, then really it does reflect in the work, right? Reflects in how we communicate and how we interact, not just with each other, but applicants. So we are looking to do a lot more of that, and team building sort of not just about the nuts and bolts about what we do, but really how can we better communicate with each other and sort of understand all of our positions and what we are responsible for and how that impacts the project. So that is definitely stuff that we're asking for as part of the upcoming budget. We hope to continue to do as we move forward.
Wonderful.
So I'd say those are-
I'll add a couple more things. I think a few years ago, we looked at reorganizing the planning team just to make sure that the workloads were manageable. And that's why we have now Eric, the long-range manager, and a principal planner to help him, knowing that we're going to have to pull in planners to work on long-range projects and the 2 DCAs. And I think it's really helped. And this year, our city manager has been very supportive of us trying to reorganize the building team, because that was very flat. And when we look at the number of permits coming through, it's clear to us that we need more of an organizational structure into 3 distinct teams, an inspection team, the fire team, they do all of the fire inspections and the fire plan checks. And then of course, the permit team itself, and learning the new system, learning a better project management approach. So all that's kind of on our plate. And Lindsay's going to help do that at the same time that we're trying to do this new e-permits MV system for planning and public works and start, at least begin the process to do a land management system. So a lot going on, and I'm just proud to say that we're probably one of the few cities that have a position dedicated to this. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it seems like a very good and innovative approach there. I guess two more lines of questioning, and very likely gonna relate back to this. Very likely. So I am curious as well. So the last item in terms of like, that we discussed in a public meeting was like the North Bayshore project, which obviously is like crazy huge, like almost like mega project, right? One of the things that I'm curious about is where public benefits fall within the scope of the development review process, and who essentially takes the lead within the department on interfacing with applicants with regards to what some might call a negotiation around that. And one of the reasons why I'm just kind of like even thinking through this in regards to this discussion is, if we're talking about like staff resourcing, if we're talking about like, our ability to have to kind of almost like innovate to be able to deliver on a lot of the servicing that we have to do. In my mind, maybe I'm totally mistaken or naive around how it might work from the other end, right? When I'm just using the Google and Lend-Lease project as a very handy reference here, it would seem to me like for a project of that type, there would be a team of specialized individuals that Lend-Lease is probably paying, a lead planner, a lead architect, designer, what have you. And one of those might be like a lead negotiator, right? Who interfaces with the city and says, hey, here's what we can offer up, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with regards to the city's ability to also be able to be effective in those, what some might call negotiations, it might be very challenging to do that when there is not necessarily what I would call under-resourcing, but maybe not that same level of dedicated resourcing to a project like that, or a public benefit like that. So I guess I'm curious, where and how the public benefits fall within regards of the development review process, and then B, how it is determined outside of direct direction from the city council, but if there was ambiguity there, even within that direction, like who takes the lead, or not individually necessarily like names, but within the schematic of the department, like who takes the lead on establishing the negotiating position and then making a determination around what's acceptable within that frame.
So, we've got two kinds of benefits, and thank you for that question. It's a good one. And what I would say is a development agreement is a little bit different than a typical project condition of approval, right? Because we've got standards, they're set, and we have conditions of approval based on it. We also have a community benefit requirement in many of our precise plans.
And I'm not talking about that one.
Okay, you're talking about the other one. And those are also set. In the case of development agreements, they're an agreement, so it's not a condition that the city can lay on it. So we do go to the council and get direction from them, and we've had a couple of sessions in this case asking for some basic information. And thereafter, we work under the direction of the city manager's office. We've got the different department directors who are very involved. We have the city attorney's office, we have consulting attorneys, and then we have other consultants to help us if we need assessments of one sort or the other.
Okay. And so for example, the last time that North Bayshore came up, right, just like in terms of like how the whole slow, almost like glacial pace of the project, right? And my understanding is that council members, certainly definitely commissioners, I think it's in the charter, they're not to interface individually with staff members, seek feedback, input, et cetera, right, that kind of nature. And so if the city council provided direction 8 months ago, just like using this as an example, a scenario like this, right? If they provided direction 8 months ago and the next time it goes to a public hearing is 8 months later in front of the EPC, and within 8 months, there's so much time that initial direction, almost like a game of telephone, right? Like where that initial direction, based on staff's back and forth with, Lend-Lease's lead negotiator, and, they have basically done everything they can, ostensibly, to pick away at, the city's position. And then when it comes to the EPC, I guess one thing I'm just curious about is what is the either legally prescribed or in general, if there isn't such a legal prescription, what is the best practice for a city disclosing or being transparent about what and how the negotiating position evolved during those 8 months for a project of that scale?
Well, I can tell you, it's like a project review, for example, right? It evolves, and we make findings in the ordinance when we make recommendations. So a lot of the recommendations reflect those findings, and we take our guidance from many, many city documents. But ultimately, we are the core principles are the ones that we got direction from the council on. And thereafter, our city manager is the one who's providing us direction. And so if you're asking, the development agreement ordinance will reflect all of those findings. And that's essentially where we're looking at the value of the document. Much like a project, every tiny iteration is not specifically reported, but ultimately the whole of the document and the findings are the package that we would present. And when we come to council, we are going to talk about, let's see what happened, why it is what it is, and then the findings. So there is a definite path that we're giving them. And with every submittal of the applicant, we're tracking what we got.
So I'll convert my next question to a comment then, just to save time, and then hopefully get to the last question here. I guess if I'm hearing things correctly, and especially just considering the uniqueness of Mountain View almost with regards to being a smaller city, with respect to just absolute footprint size, I don't think we're a LA or we're not one of these larger cities that we have very intensive development projects, relatively speaking, that happen within the city. And when there are, a significant amount of, for example, public impacts of projects of this scale, and the ability for, a city of our size to be able to get as much benefit out of having a project of that scale occur. It would seem like if there is not what some might call either a dedicated city negotiator, or whether it be training of negotiation skills, if planning staff are not trained in that kind of approach, or if it's typical for larger cities to have such kind of dedicated roles. And we being in that unique position of having such intensive development for a city of our size might benefit from something like that as part of an efficiency, or for the public benefit. That's just one thing I was thinking through. But then the last question I had was, you mentioned findings actually, and it's a little bit not totally unrelated, but some of our conditional permitting language, and is Sandy on the line? Yeah. No? Okay. Well, I might ask her anyway outside of this, but I'm also curious, I guess, to hear from you, if that's all right. There's language in some of our permit, kind of in the chapter 36, the zoning code, right? With regards to findings. So I'll just give you one example, right? Under, I think it's planned unit development. There is a language that says something along the lines of the zoning administrator or city council may approve a PUD if all of the following findings are made. And then if you go down, there's like a letter G, and it says the location, size, design, and operating characteristics of the proposed project are not detrimental to the public interest, health, safety, convenience, or welfare of the community. So my question is, how and who and what, or any combination thereof, is the definition of the public interest, health, safety, convenience, or welfare of the community? How is that determined as part of like staff's review process? I guess I'll start there. Like how is that defined within your guys' like review?
Well, I'll start and then maybe you can give details. We start with, we've got a lot of documents that guide us as we go through it. We look at the general plan, we look at the precise plan. Is it consistent with the code? We've got environmental review, mitigations, we've got conditions of approval. And we go through all of those to see if we have checked the boxes, and then we derive our conclusion based on that. But I don't know if you've got
no, I think
other details.
You pretty much hit it in terms of, we rely on our code and regulations really, and we rely on state law or federal law to really guide us on that. So that's what we're really relying on.
Okay. And last question then. It seems to me like a lot of, like between the pressure that the state is kind of like pressing down on with regards to the cities, like, I guess like the need to develop, right? Like the state seems to be moving in this direction of like, we want development to happen. And then the city, appears to be in like, we want to review, but also we kind of got to get things moving along. I'm wondering what's the latitude that is like legally like defensible in terms of a city denying a project based on detriments to like the public interest, health, safety, and that being essentially like legally defensible. I know we're not lawyers here. I know Sandy's not online, but like, is it like, this is gonna block someone's view? Is it like, this is gonna, cause, our vulnerable populations to be displaced and bring us less housing as a result? Like, what is the actual like latitude that constitutes a defensible denial of a project based on a detriment to like the public interest, health, safety, convenience? And if that's not something you're like able to speak to like conceptually, like, is there a, like material example from like another city or case that you've heard of where that was like held up essentially? That's my last question.
I would say that this is probably a better question for Sandy to respond to, but just as having been a planner and gone through it, I'll go back to the findings that we make, right? Because whether a project is approved or denied, it has to be based on very solid findings and findings of fact that apply to this project. So we always go back to the rules and regulations. And there are times when we're not able to address a particular issue because currently the documents we have don't support that finding of fact. And I'll give you the example of displacement. I think that was extremely frustrating for the community when that happened. Fortunately, SB 330 came in and put kind of a placeholder for it. But the council has flagged that as an issue. And so the solution to it then would be to create local regulations that address it. Because now you have the findings that you can make a fact, right? So just to kind of help you understand that, a lot of it, we have to go back to our legal team. They look at case law, they look at where the limits of our abilities are, past practice, how we interpreted the code. So there's a lot of that goes into making a finding of approval or denial. And then there are times when it can't be denied that we can actually work on legislative solutions.
Thank you.
I'll just add, that's a particularly difficult finding to make. So there are definitely case law examples, recent ones, even to one of our adjacent cities, that denied a project based on that and it was overturned. And so they were forced to proceed with processing the building permit. So, that's also what we would rely on is case law.
Yeah, we look at case law all the time, and there are a lot of recent cases. And so I think the good news is, we've got a very, very progressive council and a very supportive planning commission that allows us to work on these legislative solutions. And I keep coming back to the long range planning. I think it goes a long way to help guide individual developments, just because we've done so much work on the long range plans. And it kind of helps us with the findings and creating the legislative backbone.
So to sum up, in a sense, everything goes back to what is by law. So we're looking at our zoning ordinance, we're looking at our master plans, our precise plans, our general plans, and everything is pretty much gauged against those documents of
when we're looking at
quasi-judicial
yes,
ones.
yes.
Right. So
we have to go back to what do our rules say
exactly,
and how have we applied them.
Okay, I understand. So I think at the trying to bring it back to how we can be more effective as an EPC when we review things, it is helpful, I think, when it's sort of flagged, when a project comes before us and it's flagged as this is ministerial, right? I'm sure you've done it before. And so this is what we're doing. You don't have to do it every time in the staff report, but just kind of give the signals that this is a certain kind of project. These are the things that we're trying to match it against. Just be more open and direct and clear about it. I think not only helps us, it helps the public. And that way, in a sense, I'm not saying that they don't understand it, because I don't even understand it sometimes. So it helps educate everyone along the way. And the more everyone understands what's going on, the more efficient and better the input can be, because we're closing in on fewer and fewer opportunities to do so. And I know I've heard lots of comments from the public throughout a long number of years that it seems like we don't get to see projects until they're almost fully baked. And I know in the review process, it's a long one and a lot of things have to happen before we get there and things have to be in place. But maybe that's something we can discuss in a future date, is perhaps, where can we change the process where we can kind of see things a little bit sooner so that input from the public can be taken in a little bit sooner. Maybe it's not coming to us sooner, whatever it is, however it ends up being, that it can be improved. And I think that's a conversation worth having later too. I'm just so happy we did this, because you can see how many questions have come up. And I think the more we understand what goes on behind the curtain, the clearer we are. And I think the clearer the public is. And so as COVID has sort of drifted off, not into the past, but as a new way of being, it produced some new processes through Zoom. But I do like being in person. I do like the ability to then have more of these communications and more sort of education and communication flowing both ways. And if we can continuously have that more consistently, I think it's only going to improve the whole overall process. So if there's a possibility and everyone is okay with that, that we can do or think about what we want to talk about at the next one, just put it out there as there's another one to be had. Let's figure out what we want to talk about there. I would be thrilled. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I'm all for more communication. It just leads to less miscommunication in the future. Yeah, exactly. We could decide, maybe, is that something, I don't know what the process is, Eric, for deciding on retreats, whether or not to have it, if we have it, what we discuss, because I don't necessarily feel like I'm the chair, I should be deciding. I feel like we should all kind of maybe have a say on that.
Well, again, I think that's a great idea. And then from time to time, we've done different kinds. I know that when I used to staff the planning commission, sometimes they wanted to walk around and look at certain developments or certain opportunities, or a discussion like this where you want to learn more about process. So I think it's a great idea to kind of think about different topics that are relevant to the projects you're going to be looking at and learning more. We have quite a robust work program for the planning commission and staff in the next couple of years. So you can use that to guide a lot of your topics. It's great.
Yes, sure.
So just a point of clarification, one question. Goes back to Alex's discussion with you about the DA. So just for clarification's sake, what I'm understanding is that when you go through that process, it's a publicly held hearing throughout the course of its life cycle. When you get updates and feedback and suggestions in general from what's been conveyed to you, to council, city council, then with you as well. But along the way, when there are negotiations involved and council is part of the process for the decision-making and the ultimate proposal discussions with opposing council and their firm, I believe, are those held also? Aren't they held in, or are they not held in closed session? Or is this all public discourse?
No, I mean, it, like any project, we have discussions with the applicant, and we've got our negotiating attorneys on our side who are experienced in DAs also. And so there are conversations, but the public hearings are at the ZA and the council, and then at the study sessions, where we're bringing the key items for discussion.
So then the direct question then is, when this process is ongoing, are there ever closed session updates given to city council or not?
No, the council is acting as a Brown Act body in this case, and they only act in public sessions.
Thank you for the clarification. I think that makes a big difference because different bodies act a different way. In my previous experience, we would have negotiation updates from our council within closed session updates, right?
It's different when the council is acting in its capacity as landowner. Those you might have closed sessions on, but not on projects like this.
Right, and hence the question, right?
And again,
the
legal team gives us direction about how to have it. So if there's a discussion to buy a lot or lease a lot, that's when the council might have give direction to staff in a closed session. It's very circumscribed.
Sure.
These matters are discussed in open.
And that's a distinction I wanted to clarify for the general public to know, so that there is no confusion in terms of how the process works.
Thank you.
It's all open. There's nothing behind the scenes.
No.
Even if it's a formal update that's given to council in the closed session format where advice of council is shared, that's not applicable in this case because it's all an open process.
It's all an open process.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
How common are DAs? How common are DAs? I mean, if we get 100 projects all together, do 10 have DAs? Does one have DA?
Yeah.
Does a 10th of a percent have a DA?
Typically, a DA is kind of a bit of a heavy lift. So you will see them in large projects like master plans, where the typical life cycle or typically a permit needs to be, as Lindsay described, in order to vest the permit, you have to start construction within 2 years. And it's not possible in a project of this size to start construction everywhere. And so a DA is appropriate at that time where you're looking at the timelines. And as part of that, you as a city can negotiate things you couldn't normally negotiate as a condition of approval, right? So we can look at that. We also have to look at how the building lays out, how the construction lays out. So it has to be very practical. It has to have community benefits, and it basically needs to allow the build out of the project in an orderly fashion that allows the city to also construct its infrastructure in time, right? I mean, for a project of this size. We've had a few DAs for the LASD transfer of development rights projects. And those typically have been running the length of the MOU that the cities had with the school district, because they've a certain timeline and they've asked for a little more time, and they're giving millions of dollars to the district. So we supported those, and council supported those. Those are examples. And then let me think.
I can tag on real quick. So if you want to think of it like this, we have roughly 80 development projects that we report on in our current project list on a regular basis. Of the 80, some of those have DAs. We have about 6 or 7 active DAs right now. Total.
With the bulk of them.
This doesn't include the single family homeowner.
Correct. It's going to be related to what she started. It's about the scale of the project, or we often see them come up in as the economy declines. We see it more common for non-residential to start potentially like office developments ask for them.
And another example is, I think, Marwood, when that got approved by the council, they needed a little more time. They're helping, at least in the DA, they're proposing to help fund the construction of a garage, it's providing parking. So when you've got an unusual arrangement like that, it might be an occasion for a DA. We go to council asking, is this something of interest? And the council says, yes, we go work on it, you know. So it's not typical. And we've had quite a few because of the TDR projects, I would say. But in the timeline of the city, we really honestly haven't had too many.
Okay, any remaining last closing comments, questions?
Closing comment. Thank you for your patience and your time. This is not an easy position to be in because sometimes you feel like, what's next? Right? What other questions coming up? What other issues coming up? But I think one of the reasons why it was suggested to have something like this is so that we can all figure out what our roles are in general in the overall scheme of things. And I'm very appreciative and supportive that we all agreed to support the LMS to be one of the top 10 issues that City Council looked at so that they can implement that for you and the team to be more efficient, more productive, but to keep this pace going, because without having it and being like this and providing this type of service, that's truly an amazing job, right? Because you're not using an automated system to convey responses on an as-need basis to all the different projects that you're facing as a whole. And to do that individually as human beings, who needs AI? Okay. All right. So thank you so much for all your help with all that stuff and bringing to light where we fit in within this world of the decision-making process. And I'm glad everyone, I'm hoping, found value in all this, because I think once we do these things, we get closer together as a team, we become more functional with our roles and have a better understanding. Those who have been previously with City Council, Commissioner Clark has that experience, which is invaluable to us as well. And Commissioner Cranston as well, with all his years of experience. Some of us don't have that. And so this is very insightful for us. And I'm sure the community appreciates also the opportunity to learn more about how you all handle these things and how you bring them before us so that we can, in the end, help out with what we can when we say yay or nay to what's brought up to us. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having us present.
Well, we'll officially adjourn item 5 and move on to commission staff announcements, updates, requests, and committee reports. I didn't know if anybody had anything to report or
Let's see. So in terms of next EPC meeting, we actually don't have anything scheduled. So, August. So I'm not going to formally cancel the meetings in June, but we don't have any until, the weeks or so beforehand, just in case something comes up. But it does look like the June 7th meeting is very likely going to be canceled. We don't currently have anything scheduled for the June 20th. So if we don't see each other again, have a great summer. We do have a bunch of stuff coming up in the new year, including
all the stuff in the housing
development project.
Not yet.
Code amendments, the historic preservation ordinance, which we started working on and want to bring back to you. We're starting to work again on R3, and so there's definitely going to be a lot of work.
Okay, thank you.
Council decide on. That came up last week, right? On the side streets.
Oh, Castro.
They supported, we made changes based on EPC's direction on the side streets. We made changes in the actual Ped Mall sidewalk width to 60, so it addressed most of them that would qualify. And council adopted it.
Thank you. Okay. Well, barring anything else, last minute, we will adjourn the meeting at 9:45 p.m.
Thank you.
You're the hero of Dana Street.
Thank you.
It's all marked up.
Yeah, I'm in the office.
Bye, everyone.
She's like, oh, people can